Hi, I'm Dana Pasley, and for my Capstone project, I decided to compare the effectiveness of recasting and focus stimulation intervention techniques. I chose this topic because I believe that a child performs best in his or her natural environment and is more likely to carry over things learned in his or her natural environment than in a prescriptive environment such as a speech room or even a classroom. But before we get started, there are a few key terms that you'll need to know to understand fully all of the slides. First would be natural environment. I kind of broadly define this as the environment where the child feels most comfortable and it encourages spontaneous speech and language. The naturalistic conversation training will come up in our first article, and this is just providing a correct model directly following a child's incorrect production of speech. And recasting and focus stimulation are both examples of this. Next, we have recasting, which is adding adult utterances to spontaneous child utterances. For example, if the child says, "that dog," the adult could say, "that is a big dog." Next is the actual recast, because this was kind of confusing to me. So the recast is what the adult says after the child produces an incorrect utterance or grammatical phrase. And then lastly, focus stimulation is when you arrange activities to encourage the use of a target. So it's kind of like recast or recasting, but it's more structured. So you know what you want to do going in, and you bring the child to an environment, or you make an environment for the child that would evoke the response you want, but naturally. Okay, so let's get started. The first article we're going to talk about is the application of naturalistic conversation training to speech production in children with speech disabilities. This article was written by Stephen Camerata, and it was written to prove that the best learning comes from a natural environment. So researchers took two children who both had speech sound disorders. The clinicians that worked with these children throughout this project were only allowed to use interventions that aided the children in correct speech production naturally. Another way to say it is that all therapy was child-directed. This study went on for about 3.5 months, and at that time, all the targets, so all of the speech errors, had been fixed. So the child was able to produce all of the errors correctly after 3.5 months. But the most important fact is that after 9 months, multiple listeners per each child reported positive, consistent overall communication. There were several good things about this study. For instance, the qualification for a phoneme to be a target in the study. Not only did the targets have to be age appropriate for the child, but they also had to be produced 0% of the time when given a speech evaluation. What this means is the child was in no way stimulatable to these errors, meaning that you can't say that the child could have fixed these errors on his or her own in 3.5 months because they were not even emerging at that time. Next would be the training of clinicians. The article talks extensively about how clinicians were trained before the study began, but also they were monitored during the study to make sure that there was no drill or traditional measures of speech therapy that were clinician-led rather than child-led involved. So the validity of the study was kept during this. I also like the fact that this study included a measure of generalization. I find that a lot of the studies I read report great findings at the end, but you never know what happens to the participants after 3 or 6 or 9 months. But not only did this study show how the students were doing after 9 months, but it also showed the progression, that it was consistent. It showed that after 3, 6, and 9 months, they were still producing all of their targeted sounds correctly. However, as with any study, there were also a few limitations. For instance, the sample size. This study was only performed on 2 students. Therefore, it's hard to generalize these findings to our population. Had the sample size been bigger, had there been 30 in each group and the findings were still consistent, it would be a lot more reputable. Also, and this may be nitpicky, but the age difference of participants. In the description of participants, it listed that there is a 5-month age difference. Now, I know from experience and language development classes that between the age of 3.5 and 4.5, a child's language and speech are expanding exponentially, even if it's not being outwardly seen in the child's brain. There is so much growth during that time that even 5 months, I think, makes a difference between these 2 participants. Lastly, both children had prior speech therapy, and the techniques were not listed. So they could have been trained using traditional measures or more naturalistic measures, and therefore it not really been only 3.5 months before these results were found, but they could have been experiencing a buildup of these results in previous sessions. So now that we know that a natural environment is best, and we know that there are 2 interventions that provide this, recasting and focused stimulation, how do we know which one of those is best? And that's what my capstone project is about. Okay, so the next article we're going to focuses on recasting as a therapy method. So this article's title is Simultaneous Treatment of Grammatical and Speech Comprehensibility Defects in Children with Down Syndrome. The cool thing about this study is that it not only looks at recasting in speech, but also in language and grammar. 6 children who had Down syndrome participated in this study. Participants would come to one-on-one therapy a couple of times a week and receive treatment using the recasting method. Speech recasts were given to the least intelligible utterances. So the things that the child said that were less likely to be understood by a stranger were corrected via recast. And grammatical recast followed intelligible yet grammatically incorrect utterances. By the end of the study, speech comprehensibility in 4 of the 6 children had improved, and there was a growth in MLU, which is mean length of utterance, so the longer the phrase that they're talking, more complex sentences, in 5 of the 6 children. The strengths of this study included cross-checking of data. During sessions, the clinician who was performing the recasting method would take down data, but also there was a panel of other clinicians watching in, taking data at the same time. And then after the session, everyone would cross-check each person's data to make sure that they had heard what they thought they had heard to get the most valid results. I also like that the speech samples collected were long enough that spontaneous speech was elicited. Because if you have a short sample, you're probably going to get a lot of highly rehearsed utterances, and those are things that we say and we don't even think about saying them, and they are grammatically correct or they may be produced correctly, but it's not because we're applying techniques to do that, it's just because we're used to saying them. So these samples were long enough to include spontaneous, unique speech to that individual. Once again, the limitations to this study would start off with a small sample size. There were only 6 participants. So it's hard to generalize this to our whole population or even just to the Down syndrome population of people we treat. There's also a varying medical history between participants. It said anywhere from mild to severe previous health problems. I can only imagine that with this range of issues, that fatigue or medication or some other outside variable could have affected how the participants performed. Also, there was a noted variance in mental age of participants, which I also think affects how we look at this study in forms of external validity, being able to apply it to similar situations and having the same result. Alright, and the last article we're going to talk about talks about focus stimulation. And it's titled 2 Approaches to Facilitating Grammar in Children with Language Impairments. This study takes 30 children, anywhere from age 3 to 5, who have grammar delays, and it splits them into 2 groups. And then there's another group of grammar delayed students who do not receive treatment. But for us, let's just look at these 2 groups. So it splits the 30 children into 2 groups. One of the groups is led by clinicians, like traditional speech therapy one-on-one with the speech pathologist. And then the other group is led by a parent who has been trained by clinicians. Both groups use focus stimulation as their way of targeting the child's goals. At the end of the study, the results were that regardless of the facilitator, so be it a clinician or a parent, when administered properly, focus stimulation enhances verb, pronoun, and sentence complexity. So strengths, finally, a larger sample size, always good. Also, even though there was a little bit of variance in age, the researchers made sure that there was a uniform language level of participants. So everyone was on the same level language-wise, even if they were different ages. Lastly, closely monitored therapy techniques. So the clinicians who were providing therapy were being monitored and closely watched to make sure they were staying on target, and then the parents were required to come to trainings every week to ensure that they were using focus stimulation in the correct way. However, there were a few limitations. When the results came in, the parent-led group's results were not as consistent, and this is due to the fact that researchers assume that the parents may have been recasting during focus stimulation, because these things are so similar, but they think there was a crossover, and that would have boosted the child's results if it was getting 2 great interventions rather than just 1. So with previous research in mind, Dr. Kama and I plan to analyze the effectiveness of recasting versus focus stimulation in school-age children with a similar language goal or goals. We look forward to letting you know what we find. Thank you for watching my presentation.